Picture yourself standing not in the silent, sand-blown ruins we see today, but in the vibrant, sun-drenched heart of a bustling Egyptian city over 4,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of baking bread, the dust of the desert, and a uniquely sweet, tangy aroma that seems to come from every corner. This is the smell of a civilization being built, a scent so common it was as familiar to an Egyptian as the sound of the Nile. It wasn't the scent of gold or stone, but of something far more essential, far more human. It was the smell of beer. This humble, frothy beverage wasn't just an occasional treat. It was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt, consumed by everyone from the mighty pharaoh in his palace to the humblest laborer building a tomb. But what if I told you that this beer was more than just a refreshing drink? What if it was, in fact, one of the most powerful engines driving one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known? We often marvel at the pyramids, those impossible mountains of stone that defy time itself. We study the intricate hieroglyphs and the golden treasures of the pharaohs. But we rarely stop to consider what fueled the hands that raised those colossal blocks. The answer isn't just bread and water. It's a nutritious, fermented brew that provided calories, hydration, and vital vitamins in a time before modern medicine. This ancient beer was a nutritional powerhouse, but its role stretched far beyond the dinner bowl. It was woven into the very fabric of society, a form of currency used to pay the armies of workers who constructed the very monuments we admire today. Imagine receiving your wages not in coins, but in jars of a hearty, sustaining beer. This was a reality for thousands of Egyptians, making the brewers some of the most important state officials. But the story of Egyptian beer goes even deeper, into the realm of the gods and the afterlife. This beverage was considered a divine gift, a sacred offering to deities like Osiris, who is himself credited with teaching humanity the art of brewing. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a necessary element in religious ceremonies, and a crucial provision for the soul's journey into the next world. So how did they do it? Without modern laboratories, stainless steel vats, or even a basic understanding of yeast? How did the ancient Egyptians consistently brew a beer that could sustain a nation for millennia? The process was ingenious, surprisingly simple, and deeply connected to their mastery of bread making. Today, we are going to reconstruct that entire journey, from a handful of sun-baked grain to the finished, intoxicating brew. We will uncover the tools they used, the recipes they followed, and the central role this incredible beverage played in building a world of wonders. This is the story of how Egyptians brewed ancient beer, a tale of everyday magic that truly fueled an empire. To truly appreciate the masterful process of brewing, we must first grasp just how deeply this beverage was embedded in the fabric of daily existence. Think of beer not as a luxury, but as a fundamental pillar of survival and society. In a land where the Nile, while life-giving, could also harbor dangerous pathogens, the process of brewing beer, which involved boiling the water and fermentation, made it significantly safer to drink than untreated water. This made it a crucial source of hydration for the entire population, from the youngest child to the eldest elder. It was a nutritious food source, thick with carbohydrates, proteins, and vitamins from the fermented grains, often consumed as a substantial porridge-like meal that provided the energy needed for backbreaking labor under the hot Egyptian sun. This nutritional importance translated directly into economic power. The most striking example of this is found in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, the community of the highly skilled artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These men were not paid in gold or silver, but in essential goods, grain, oil, fish, and most importantly, beer. Records detail a daily ration of several jars of beer for each worker. This was not a bonus or a perk, it was their salary. The state-operated breweries were, in effect, the national treasury, and the brewmasters were critical economic officials. A disruption in the beer supply could literally halt the construction of a pharaoh's eternal resting place, making beer a matter of national security. Beyond the physical world, beer held profound spiritual significance. It was a sacred libation, a preferred offering to the gods. temples maintained their own breweries to produce the vast quantities needed for daily rituals. The goddess Hathor was even known as the Lady of Drunkenness, and in one important myth, she is pacified with a specially brewed, blood-red beer that prevents her from destroying humanity. This connection to the divine extended into death. Tombs were routinely stocked with beer to sustain the soul in the afterlife, and intricate models of breweries were placed in tombs to magically ensure an eternal supply. Even in the Hall of Judgment, as depicted in the Book of the Dead, the deceased would declare to the gods that they had not interfered with the beer ration of the spirits, highlighting its perceived importance in the cosmos. Physicians of the time also recognized its medicinal properties, prescribing beer-based concoctions for a variety of ailments, from digestive issues to gum disease. So, when we talk about ancient Egyptian beer, we are discussing something far greater than a simple alcoholic drink. We are looking at a substance that was simultaneously food, currency, medicine, and a sacred link to the gods. Mastering its production was not just a culinary art, it was essential for sustaining life, economy, and cosmic order. The entire magnificent process, from field to frothing jar, began with a single, unassuming type of grain. While today's beers are overwhelmingly made from barley, the ancient Egyptians built their brewing legacy on a different foundation, a hardy, ancient wheat known as emmer. If you were to hold a stalk of emmer wheat in your hand, you would immediately notice the difference. Unlike the relatively loose heads of modern wheat, emmer is a hulled grain. Its kernels are tightly enclosed in a tough, inedible husk, a natural armor that made it exceptionally resilient in the harsh Egyptian environment. This husk protected the precious grain inside from pests, from mold in the humid river valleys, and from being scattered by the wind during harvesting. Its nutritional profile was also superior for the time, packed with protein and fiber, which contributed to the thick, nutritious, almost porridge-like quality of the final beer. Choosing emmer wheat was not an accident. It was a decision born of brilliant agricultural adaptation. This grain thrived in the unique conditions created by the Nile's annual inundation. Each year, as the river overflowed its banks, it deposited a fresh layer of rich, black silt across the floodplains, creating unbelievably fertile soil without any need for artificial fertilizers. Egyptian farmers would sow their emmer wheat seeds as the floodwaters receded, and the crop would grow vigorously under the intense sun, relying on the moisture trapped in the earth. When the time came for harvest, typically in the early spring, teams of workers would move through the fields with wooden sickles inset with sharpened flakes of flint, cutting the golden stalks close to the ground. This entire cycle, from the life-giving flood to the harvest, was deeply intertwined with their perception of the world. The success of the emmer crop, and by extension the beer supply, was seen as a direct gift from the gods. A poor flood meant a poor harvest, which meant less beer, threatening the stability of the entire society. So the first step in brewing was not something that happened in a secluded workshop. It was a very public agricultural event that involved the entire community and was watched over by deities like Osiris, the god of agriculture and the afterlife. The journey of the beer truly started with the rhythmic swing of a sickle in a sun-drenched field, gathering the essential ingredient that would soon be transformed into the drink of both mortals and gods. Once the emmer wheat had turned a brilliant gold under the Egyptian sun, the real work began, a symphony of coordinated effort that turned the fields into a hive of activity. Teams of laborers, their movements synchronized by the rhythm of ancient work songs, would move through the fields with their simple yet remarkably effective tools. The primary instrument was the sickle, a curved wooden handle into which were set razor-sharp blades of flint. These weren't crude rocks. They were carefully knapped by skilled craftsmen to create a serrated edge that could slice through the tough stalks with surprising efficiency. For those who could afford it, a sickle with a copper blade represented the height of agricultural technology, but flint remained widely used for centuries due to its availability and sharpness. The workers would grasp a bunch of stalks in one hand, and with a swift pulling motion of the sickle in the other, cut the wheat close to the ground, gathering it into sheave. This was back-breaking labor, performed under a relentless sun, but it was a communal endeavor essential for the survival of the entire community. After the harvest, the sheaves of emmer wheat were transported to a specially prepared area known as the threshing floor. This was typically a circular patch of hard-packed earth, often located on slightly elevated ground to catch any passing breeze. Here, the process of separating the valuable grain from the inedible chaff and the tough husk began. The most common method involved a brilliant, if seemingly crude, application of animal power. The sheaves of wheat were spread out in a thick layer across the threshing floor, and donkeys or oxen were driven in a continuous circle over them. The animals' hooves would trample and crush the dried stalks, effectively breaking the brittle husks that encased the individual grains of emmer. You can almost hear the rhythmic clopping of hooves on hard earth, the dust rising in clouds around the animals and their drivers, creating a scene of controlled chaos that was repeated in villages across Egypt. This threshing process was absolutely critical. Remember, emmer is a hulled grain, meaning each kernel is tightly swaddled in a protective coating that cannot be simply rubbed off like with modern, naked grains. The forceful trampling was the only way to crack open these husks without destroying the grain inside. Once the trampling was complete, the resulting mixture of broken stalks, crushed husks, and freed grains was ready for the next stage, winnowing. Workers would use broad, flat wooden forks or shovels to toss the mixture into the air. The wind would carry away the lighter chaff and straw, while the heavier grains would fall back to the ground, a beautiful, natural method of purification. What remained was a pile of emmer grain, still partially encased in its hulls, but now accessible for the transformative processes of baking and brewing that would follow. This grain, the product of so much coordinated effort, was the true treasure, the fundamental building block from which both the daily bread and the sacred beer of Egypt would be born. Now, with the precious emmer grain cleaned and ready, we arrive at the most ingenious and defining step of the entire process, a technique that sets ancient Egyptian brewing completely apart from anything we do today. This wasn't a simple matter of soaking grains in hot water. Instead, the Egyptians performed a kind of culinary alchemy, transforming the grain into something that was neither fully bread nor fully raw dough. They created a special, purpose-built substance known as bapir. Think of bapir not as food to be eaten, but as a portable, stable, and incredibly efficient brewing ingredient. The word itself is often translated as beer bread, but that barely scratches the surface of its true function. The process began by taking a portion of the harvested emmer wheat and grinding it into a coarse flour. This was back-breaking work, typically done by women using a simple yet effective tool called a saddle quern. They would kneel on the ground, rocking a large, handheld grinding stone back and forth over stone slab, crushing the hardy grains into a rough powder. This flour was then mixed with water to form a thick, malleable dough. Unlike bread meant for the table, this dough might have been sweetened with a handful of mashed, ripe dates or flavored with other available ingredients, but its primary purpose was functional, not gourmet. The dough was then shaped into small, dense loaves or thick, flat discs, ready for the transformative heat of the oven. But here is the crucial part, the secret of the entire operation. These bapir loaves were not fully baked. They were given only a very brief encounter with the fire. Imagine a mud brick oven, its interior glowing with heat from a fire of straw and dried dung. The baker would slide the loaves inside, but instead of leaving them to bake through until golden brown and fluffy, they were withdrawn after only a few minutes. The goal was merely to create a firm, toasted crust on the outside. The interior of the loaf remained essentially uncooked, a dense, starchy, and moist core. This light baking served two brilliant purposes. First, it created a sterile, protective shell around the dough, preserving it from spoilage and making it easy to store and transport, a vital consideration in a warm climate. Second, and more importantly, it left the starches and enzymes inside the grain perfectly primed for the next stage. By not applying prolonged, destructive heat, the Egyptians kept the biological machinery of the grain alive and active. The starches had been gelatinized just enough on the outside to be accessible, while the interior remained a raw powerhouse of potential, waiting for water to wake it up. This half-baked bread was, in essence, a perfectly packaged starter kit for fermentation, a testament to an empirical understanding of chemistry that was centuries ahead of its time. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and hotly debated questions in the study of ancient Egyptian brewing. Did they understand and intentionally use the science of malting? In modern brewing, malting is a foundational step. Barley is soaked in water to trigger germination, causing the grain to sprout. This natural process awakens a powerful enzyme called diastase, which has a single, crucial job: to break down the grain's complex starches into simple, fermentable sugars. These sugars are the primary food source for yeast, which in turn produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Without this conversion, you simply cannot have beer as we know it. The question is, did Egyptian brewers, thousands of years before the discovery of enzymes, somehow stumble upon or master this biochemical trick? The evidence is intriguingly contradictory. On one hand, laboratory analyses of residues scraped from the interiors of ancient Egyptian beer jars have occasionally detected chemical signatures consistent with malted grains. These scientific findings suggest that, at least sometimes, the brewing process involved sprouted grain. However, this physical evidence is not yet widespread enough to be conclusive. On the other hand, the vast majority of artistic and textual evidence we have, from tomb paintings to hieroglyphic inscriptions, overwhelmingly depicts the method we just described: the use of partially baked beer bread, or bapir. There are no clear illustrations of grain being deliberately soaked and sprouted for brewing purposes. This creates a historical puzzle. Were the Egyptians using two different methods, or is there a way to reconcile these two seemingly separate paths to fermentation? A compelling theory proposes that the Egyptians may have inadvertently achieved the same chemical result as malting through their unique bread-making technique. Remember the bapir, the half-baked loaf that was toasted on the outside, but remained raw and moist within. When this dough was crumbled into warm water in the fermentation vat, the starches on the toasted exterior would have readily dissolved. But what about the raw, starchy interior? Here's where nature might have taken over. If the grain used to make the bapir had been stored in a slightly damp condition, or if the dough itself was left to sit for a period before its light baking, a natural, low-level germination could have begun. The Egyptians would have needed to understand the enzyme diastase. They would only need to observe that grain which had gotten a little damp produced a better, sweeter, more potent beer. This accidental malting could have occurred without any formal process. A sack of grain left near the Nile's humidity, flour ground from grain that had started to sprout in the granary. These everyday occurrences could have introduced just enough active enzymes into the bapir dough to kickstart the sugar conversion once it met water. The partial baking was the masterstroke. It was just enough heat to preserve the dough and add some gelatinized starch, but not so much that it destroyed any naturally occurring enzymes that might have been present. In essence, the Egyptian method may have been a beautifully efficient hybrid, combining the controlled application of heat with the uncontrolled but observed magic of natural germination. They may not have spoken the language of biochemistry, but through generations of careful observation, they perfected a practical system that harnessed its power, turning simple emmer wheat into the liquid foundation of their civilization. With the bapir loaves cooled and ready, the next stage was a physical and transformative one. The dense, partially baked discs had to be broken down. Using their hands or perhaps simple stone tools, brewers would crumble the loaves into a coarse mixture, creating something that looked more like oversized breadcrumbs or a granola than a modern brewing ingredient. This wasn't a fine powder. The goal was to increase the surface area, creating countless tiny portals for water to penetrate and work its magic. These crumbs, still holding the potential of both the toasted exterior and the raw, starchy interior, were then carried to the heart of the brewery, the fermentation vat. These vats were typically large, wide-mouthed jars made of coarse, porous clay known as zers. They were not unlike the massive amphorae used for storing grain or wine, but their purpose was far more active. The crumbled bapir was poured into the vat, and then the brewers added the final key ingredient, warm water, likely drawn directly from the Nile or a canal. This was not a quick stir. The mixture was worked by hand, kneaded and squeezed to ensure every particle of bread was saturated. The result was a thick, lumpy, porridge-like substance that modern brewers would recognize as the mash. This step is where the invisible chemistry, which the Egyptians understood only through its results, truly began. Inside that warm, watery slurry, a silent, miraculous conversion was taking place. Whether from the natural germination of grain that occurred before baking, or from the specific conditions of the partial bake itself, enzymes present in the emmer wheat sprang into action. These biological catalysts, specifically diastase, started breaking apart the long, complex chains of starch molecules that made up the bulk of the grain. Think of these starches as a massive, tangled necklace. The enzymes act like precise molecular scissors, snipping the necklace into individual, manageable beads. These beads are simple sugars, primarily maltose. This conversion from starch to sugar is absolutely fundamental. Without it, yeast has nothing to consume, and without yeast, there is no fermentation and no alcohol. The warmth of the water accelerated this process, creating an ideal environment for the enzymes to work efficiently over a period of several hours or even a full day. The mash would slowly transform, its flavor becoming progressively sweeter as the starches turned into the food that would soon fuel a microscopic workforce. Now, with the sweet, starchy mash prepared, it was time for the mixture to enter its final vessel, a container as vital to the process as the grain itself. The workhorse of the ancient Egyptian brewery was the zur, a large, wide-mouthed jar made from coarse, unglazed clay. These weren't delicate, decorative pots. They were functional, sturdy workhorses, often set into the cool earth or placed on stable stone platforms to keep them secure. Their design was brilliantly suited to the task. The thick, porous clay walls of the zur acted like a natural climate control system. In the intense heat of the Egyptian day, the water slowly evaporating through the microscopic pores of the jar would draw heat away from the liquid inside, helping to keep the fermenting beer relatively cool. At night, as the desert air grew chilly, the same insulating properties of the clay would help retain a stable, gentle warmth, protecting the delicate biological process happening within. This passive temperature regulation was absolutely essential for a successful fermentation, and the Egyptians achieved it not with technology, but with a deep understanding of their materials. But the true, invisible magic of the fermentation began not with the vessel, but with what it invited inside. The Egyptians had no concept of microorganisms. They knew nothing of yeast cells or bacteria. What they did possess was generations of accumulated practical wisdom. They knew that if they left this warm, sugary porridge in an open zur, something wonderful would happen. They were effectively laying a trap for the unseen world. The wide mouth of the jar was an open invitation to the wild, airborne yeasts that drifted on every breeze. These microscopic fungi, unique to the local environment of each village, even each household, would settle on the surface of the mash and begin to feast. This is where the alchemy reached its peak. The yeast cells consumed the simple sugars that the enzymes had so carefully prepared, and as they ate, they produced two main byproducts, carbon dioxide gas and ethanol alcohol. The brewer would know the process was working by the telltale signs. The mixture would begin to bubble and froth, a lively activity that signaled the transformation was underway. After a few days, the thick, porridge-like consistency would start to break down, and the liquid would clarify, turning from a murky paste into a recognizable, effervescent beverage. This relationship with yeast was not a secret discovered solely for beer. It was part of a beautiful, symbiotic dance with their daily bread. The same wild yeast strains that floated into the brewery were also settling on the dough prepared in the bakery next door. In many households and state-run production centers, baking and brewing were two sides of the same coin, often conducted in adjacent rooms or by the same skilled workers. It's highly likely that the unique microbial fingerprint of a particular place, the specific blend of yeast and bacteria living in the air, on the tools, and ingrained in the very walls, imparted a distinct character to the sourdough bread and the beer. A brewer in Memphis might produce a slightly tangier beer than a brewer in Thebes, not by recipe, but by the invisible life teeming in their workspace. This unintentional cultivation of a local microbiome meant that every batch of beer was a living product of its environment, a unique snapshot of the microbial world of ancient Egypt. They mastered this invisible force through careful observation and repetition, creating a consistent, intoxicating result from what must have seemed, to them, like pure magic. While the emmer wheat provided the foundational body and nutrition, the ancient Egyptian palate, much like our own, craved a touch of sweetness to balance the earthy, sometimes bitter, notes of the grain. For this, they turned to a gift from the palm groves that line the Nile, the humble, yet incredibly versatile, date. Flourishing in the hot, sun-drenched climate, date palms were as much a part of the Egyptian landscape as the river itself. These trees were cultivated with great care in orchards and private gardens, their long, graceful fronds providing welcome shade, and their heavy clusters of fruit offering a concentrated source of natural sugar. Dates were a dietary staple, eaten fresh or dried, and their incredible sweetness made them the perfect candidate for enhancing their most important beverage. Adding dates to beer wasn't just a matter of flavor. It was a stroke of biochemical genius that would have significantly impacted the final product. The methods for incorporating this natural sweetener were straightforward and effective, reflecting the practical nature of Egyptian brewing. In the simplest approach, ripe dates would have been pitted and crushed by hand or with a stone, creating a sticky, fibrous paste. This paste could be stirred directly into the warm mash of crumbled bapir and water, where the simple sugars from the fruit would dissolve instantly. This immediate sugar rush provided a fast-acting food source for the wild yeasts, giving fermentation a vigorous and energetic start. For a more refined and potent addition, brewers might have first transformed the dates into a syrup. By gently heating the crushed fruit with a little water, they could extract the sugars, creating a thick, caramel-like liquid that could be stored and added with precision to different batches. This date syrup, known in later periods, would have blended seamlessly into the wort, ensuring an even distribution of sweetness and a clearer final product. This addition had profound effects beyond just taste. From a purely scientific perspective, the sugars in dates, primarily fructose and glucose, are highly fermentable. Yeast consumes these simple sugars with great efficiency, producing more alcohol as a result. So a beer brewed with a healthy portion of dates would have been noticeably stronger than one made from grain alone. This boost in alcohol content would have made the beer more preserving, extending its shelf life in a world without refrigeration. But the contribution of dates was more than just alcoholic. The fruit would have imparted a distinct, fruity ester character to the brew, a subtle note of caramel and dried fruit that would have beautifully complemented the bready, slightly nutty flavor of the emmer wheat. This created a more complex and undoubtedly more enjoyable drinking experience. It's a flavor profile that some experimental archaeologists and modern craft brewers attempting to recreate ancient beers have noted, a surprising depth and drinkability that challenges our modern assumption that ancient beverages were crude or unpalatable. The use of dates showcases a sophisticated understanding of balancing flavors, transforming a functional, calorie-rich gruel into a genuinely sought-after drink that pleased the senses as much as it sustained the body. While dates provided a reliable and delightful sweetness, the Egyptian quest for flavor likely didn't stop there. Imagine a master brewer, perhaps working in a temple brewery, tasting a batch and feeling it needed something more, a different aromatic dimension, a hint of bitterness to cut through the sweetness, or a medicinal quality to enhance its restorative power. With a vast and sophisticated culinary tradition, it is almost certain that Egyptians experimented with a whole pantry of local herbs and exotic spices to create unique and regional beer varieties. Although direct archaeological proof is elusive, organic materials like herbs rarely survive millennia in the hot sand, we can piece together a compelling picture from the ingredients they used in other aspects of their lives. One of the most promising candidates is coriander. We have solid evidence that the ancient Egyptians cultivated and cherished this aromatic herb. Its seeds have been found in Tutankhamun's tomb, placed there for his use in the afterlife, underscoring their value. Coriander seeds have a warm, citrusy, and slightly floral aroma that would have complemented the earthy notes of emmer wheat beautifully. When crushed and added during the brewing process, they would have imparted a complex fragrance and a subtle, spicy flavor that is still popular in certain Belgian wheat beers and historical beer recreations today. Similarly, other common garden herbs like thyme or mint could have been used. Thyme, with its earthy, slightly pungent character, might have been chosen for its perceived medicinal qualities, as it was used in remedies for respiratory ailments. Mint would have offered a refreshing, cool finish, making the beer even more quenching on a hot day. Venturing beyond the garden, Egyptian brewers had access to a world of exotic flavors through their extensive trade networks. To the south, in Nubia and Punt, grew trees producing aromatic resins like myrrh and frankincense. While these were primarily used for incense in religious ceremonies, it's not a great stretch to imagine a brewer, perhaps one employed by a temple, experimenting with a tiny amount of powdered resin to create a sacred, fragrant beer for a specific festival, giving it an otherworldly, perfumed quality fit for the gods. From the eastern deserts or via trade with the Levant, they could have acquired juniper berries. Juniper has a long history in European brewing, most famously in gin, but its sharp, piney flavor is excellent for balancing sweetness and adding a crisp, clean bitterness. The use of juniper would have produced a beer with a distinctly different profile, one that might have been prized for its bracing, invigorating character. The distinction between flavoring and medicine was often blurred in the ancient world. Many herbs we consider culinary were primarily valued for their health benefits. A brewer might add a handful of a specific herb not just for taste, but because it was believed to soothe an upset stomach, ward off illness, or increase vitality. This practice would transform the beer from a simple, nutritious beverage into a potent tonic. The experimentation would have been endless and deeply localized. A brewer in the Delta region, surrounded by marsh plants, might have used papyrus reeds or other aquatic herbs, while a brewer in Upper Egypt might have favored desert shrubs like a form of sage. This means that there probably was no single ancient Egyptian beer. Instead, there was a spectrum of beers, each with its own character defined by the local water, the unique wild yeast in the air, and the creative additions of the brewer. This speculative journey into flavorings reveals not just a quest for taste, but a dynamic, creative culture that saw its staple beverage as a canvas for innovation, connecting their daily lives to the rich botanical world they inhabited. With the mixture of crumbled bapir, water, and dates now resting in the wide-mouthed zur jars, the most mysterious phase of the operation began. For the next several days, the brewery would transform from a place of intense physical activity into a quiet, watchful space. This was a period of patient waiting, a vigil over the silent, unseen magic happening within the clay vessels. The brewers, though they had no scientific vocabulary for microbiology, were masters of observation. They knew the signs to look for, the subtle shifts that signaled a successful transformation. The first and most obvious clue was the appearance of bubbles. Within hours, the thick, porridge-like surface would begin to stir with a gentle effervescence. Tiny pockets of carbon dioxide gas, a direct byproduct of the feasting yeast, would rise to the top, creating a soft, persistent fizz. This would soon build into a lively, bubbling froth, a creamy head that crowned the liquid and spilled slightly over the rim of the jar, a clear, visible announcement that the invisible workforce was busy at its task. This was almost certainly an open fermentation. Unlike modern brewing, where sterile, sealed tanks are used to control every variable, the ancient Egyptian method embraced the environment. The zers were left uncovered, or perhaps covered with nothing more than a loose cloth or a perforated pottery lid. This allowed the wild yeasts and bacteria native to the area floating in the air, lingering on the brewery walls, even present on the brewer's own hands, to continue colonizing the brew. Each region, each village, even each household brewery would have cultivated its own unique microbial signature. The beer from a brewery in the dense, humid air of the Delta would have developed a different character from one brewed in the dry, dusty atmosphere of Upper Egypt. This open process was a partnership with nature, a controlled invitation to the local ecosystem to impart its distinct personality into the beverage. Judging when the fermentation was complete was the true test of the brewer's skill, a knowledge base built not from textbooks, but from generations of hands-on experience passed from master to apprentice. They relied on a combination of senses that modern brewers, with their hydrometers and pH meters, might find almost artistic. Sight was the first indicator. As fermentation progressed, the thick, cloudy mash would slowly clarify. The suspended particles of grain and bread would settle at the bottom of the jar, leaving a lighter, more translucent liquid above. The vigorous, rocky head of froth would eventually subside into a thinner, more stable layer. But sight alone wasn't enough. The brewer would lean close to the zure, inhaling deeply. The initial sweet, grainy aroma would have given way to a more complex bouquet, a sharp, tangy scent from the acids produced by bacteria, and the distinct estery fragrance of alcohol, often reminiscent of ripe fruit or even a hint of spice. The final and most crucial test was taste. Using a clean, long-handled spoon, or perhaps a simple cup made from a gourd, the brewer would draw a small sample. They weren't looking for one single flavor, but for a balance. A taste that was still overwhelmingly sweet would indicate that fermentation was not yet finished. The yeast still had sugars to consume. A taste that was unpleasantly sour or vinegary signaled that unwanted bacteria had gained the upper hand, potentially spoiling the batch. The ideal brew struck a perfect harmony between the residual sweetness of the dates and grain, a pleasant tartness from natural acids, and the warming, satisfying kick of alcohol. This skill of sensory analysis was invaluable. A batch left to ferment for too long could become too acidic or weak, while one bottled too early might continue fermenting in the jar, building up dangerous pressure and causing it to explode. The brewer's experienced palate was the final quality control check, ensuring that the life-sustaining beverage that reached the people was consistently safe, nutritious, and enjoyable. After days of patient fermentation, the brewer was finally left with a finished, living product. But if you were to peer into one of those zure jars at this moment, the sight would likely surprise you. This wasn't the clear, golden liquid we associate with beer today. Instead, you would see a thick, murky, porridge-like substance filled with a swirling sediment of spent grain husks, chunks of dissolved beer bread, and a fine, cloudy suspension of yeast. This texture was not a sign of a failed batch. It was the defining characteristic of ancient Egyptian beer. The challenge for the brewer, and then for the consumer, was how to transform this nutritious sludge into a drinkable form. The solution was elegant in its simplicity and relied on tools available in every household. The primary instrument for this task was the sieve, a common object found in both humble kitchens and grand state breweries. These sieves were not made of metal mesh, but were expertly crafted from organic materials. Artisans would take flexible reeds, grasses, or even strips of palm leaf, and weave them into a sturdy, bowl-shaped basket with a perforated bottom. The weave was tight enough to trap the larger, unpleasant chunks of husk and bread, yet loose enough to allow the liquid, along with its finer, nutritious particles, to flow through. The process of straining was a hands-on, active endeavor. A servant or family member would carefully lift the heavy fermentation jar and pour its contents through the sieve, which is held over a clean, waiting drinking vessel. They might gently swirl or press the thick residue with a spoon or their hand to help the liquid separate, ensuring not a single precious drop was wasted. This freshly strained beer was then ready to be served, though it would still retain a significant cloudiness and a substantial body, more akin to a thin gruel or a modern-day smoothie than a crisp lager. This characteristic thickness was far from a flaw. It was, in fact, a key feature that contributed directly to the beer's role as a staple food. The suspended particles were not just sediment, they were undigested proteins, fibers, and vitamins from the emmer wheat and date. By consuming the beer in this state, Egyptians were ingesting a complete liquid meal that provided sustained energy release. For a laborer spending 10 hours under the sun hauling stone blocks, this hearty beverage was far more effective than a clear, watery drink. It delivered calories, hydration, and essential nutrients in a single, efficient package. The consistency also had practical benefits. In a world without precise carbonation control, the dense body of the beer would have helped to retain the carbon dioxide produced during fermentation, giving it a pleasant, slight effervescence that made it more refreshing. The visual and textural expectation was simply different. Where we might see cloudiness as a sign of impurity, an ancient Egyptian would have seen it as a mark of substance and nutritional value, a visible promise that this drink would truly satisfy and sustain them. With the beer now strained and ready, its journey was far from over. This precious, living commodity needed to be packaged for storage, transport, and ultimately, consumption across the kingdom. The ancient Egyptians were masters of ceramics, and their solution was as practical as it was elegant. For immediate local use, the freshly strained beer was often poured directly into smaller, more manageable jugs with narrow necks, known as oinochoi, or simply serving jars. These were designed for easy handling, allowing a person to pour a serving without disturbing the sediment that would inevitably settle again. But for storage or any journey longer than a few hours, a more secure method was essential to protect the brew from spoilage and contamination. The primary vessel for this purpose was the amphora, a tall, slender jar with two handles near the neck and a pointed base. While we often associate amphorae with wine, they were the all-purpose shipping containers of the ancient world, perfectly suited for transporting beer across the Nile or overland by donkey caravan. Their pointed bases were a stroke of genius for logistics. They could be stacked securely on their sides in the curved hulls of boats or embedded in the soft sand or earth of a storeroom, keeping them upright and stable. To seal the precious contents, brewers and merchants employed a simple yet effective technology. A lid made of pottery, leather, or even a large leaf would be placed over the jar's opening. Then, a thick paste of wet clay or mud would be smeared over the top, creating an airtight seal as it dried and hardened in the sun. This mud stopper was the ancient equivalent of a modern bottle cap, serving a critical dual purpose. Firstly, it prevented dust, insects, and airborne bacteria from entering and spoiling the batch. Secondly, it helped to retain whatever natural carbonation had developed during fermentation, ensuring the beer reached its destination with at least a hint of its original liveliness and froth. The scale of this distribution network was staggering, a testament to beer's role as a state-controlled commodity. Vast breweries, often attached to royal palaces or major temples, operated on an industrial scale. Imagine the scene at a royal brewery in Memphis. Dozens of workers filling hundreds of amphorae in a well-practiced assembly line. Once sealed, these jars would be loaded onto cargo ships that plied the Nile, the great liquid highway of Egypt. Their destinations were numerous and vital to the functioning of the state. A significant portion of this liquid wealth was shipped to dedicated workers' villages, like the one at Deir el-Medina. There, it would be distributed as part of the daily ration that compensated the artisans building the royal tombs. The delivery of beer was as routine and expected as the delivery of grain, and a disruption in this supply chain could bring monumental construction to a halt. Other shipments were destined for the storerooms of great temples, where beer was used in vast quantities for daily offerings to the gods and for feeding the large priesthood. Still, other amphorae, perhaps of finer quality or containing a specially brewed batch, would be destined for the royal court itself to slake the thirst of the pharaoh and his nobles. The logistics of moving this heavy, fragile cargo required immense organization. Scribes meticulously recorded each shipment, noting the number of jars, their origin, and their destination on clay ostraca or papyrus ledgers. This wasn't just a culinary operation, it was a critical branch of the state's economic and administrative machinery. The humble beer jar, sealed with a dab of mud, thus became a tiny cog in a vast system, its journey from brewery to consumer mirroring the flow of power and sustenance that held an entire civilization together. The true industrial might of ancient Egyptian brewing becomes breathtakingly clear when we leave the single household jar behind and step onto the archaeological sites of their large-scale production facilities. At the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we find evidence of a state-run operation with the precision of a modern factory. This wasn't a place for casual experimentation. It was a highly organized system designed for one purpose: to produce a consistent, reliable supply of beer for a specialized workforce as part of their regular wages. The scale is revealed not by a single large vat, but by the repetitive, orderly arrangement of the brewing infrastructure. Excavations have uncovered entire rooms dedicated to the process, with multiple grinding stations featuring heavy, worn saddle querns set into the floor, indicating that grinding grain was a continuous, high-volume activity. Nearby, rows of mud brick ovens and large circular clay vats, sometimes set in benches 2 or 3 abreast, show a production line capable of handling dozens of batches simultaneously. The entire layout suggests a division of labor, where one group was responsible for grinding, another for baking the batbeer loaves, and yet another for managing the fermentation in the long rows of zurd jars. This organized efficiency was essential, as a single day's interruption in the beer supply could halt work on the pharaoh's tomb, a risk the state simply could not take. An even more astonishing glimpse into the antiquity of industrial brewing comes from the preternastic site of Hierakonpolis, home to what might be the world's oldest known large-scale brewery, dating back over 5,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists uncovered a complex with an almost monumental feel. They found a series of large ceramic vats, each with a capacity of nearly 15 gallons, firmly set in place by mud brick supports. The arrangement was methodical, with the vats positioned in parallel rows, and the entire facility was located conveniently near the settlement's ceremonial center. The scale is staggering. Estimates suggest that this single brewery could have produced over 300 gallons of beer in one brewing cycle. This volume was far beyond the needs of a single family or even a small village. Such a massive output points to beer's central role in large communal gatherings, perhaps for religious festivals, funerary feasts, or as a tool for securing the labor and loyalty of a large population. The Hierakonpolis brewery is a powerful statement. Even before the first pyramids pierced the horizon, the Egyptians had already mastered the art and science of brewing on an industrial scale, recognizing its power to bind a society together. The physical remnants of these breweries allow us to reconstruct the workflow with remarkable clarity. The process began in dedicated courtyards with massive piles of emmer wheat, which would be ground into flour using heavy grinding stones operated by teams of workers. The resulting coarse flour was then mixed with water in large troughs to create vast quantities of dough for the batbeer. This dough was shaped and then given its characteristic partial bake in long, multi-chambered ovens, where attendants would have carefully timed the exposure to heat for hundreds of loaves at once. The heart of the operation was the fermentation room. Imagine a long, cool mud brick hall, its floor lined with dozens, if not hundreds, of identical zurd jars, each one filled with the crumbled beer bread and water mixture. The air would have been thick with the pungent, tangy smell of active fermentation, a symphony of scents from countless batches at different stages. The logistics of managing this were immense. Scribes would have been present to record the output of each batch, the number of jars filled, and their intended destination, whether for immediate distribution to workers or for storage in adjacent magazine rooms stocked with sealed amphoras. This level of organization, accounting, and standardized production reveals a sophisticated understanding of supply chain management that rivals any modern enterprise, all centered on the production of a beverage that was the literal currency of civilization. While the massive state-run breweries supplied the armies of workers and the grand ceremonies of the temples, the soul of Egyptian beer truly resided in the home. Beyond the industrial-scale vats and administrative records, brewing was a fundamental domestic art, as integral to the household as baking bread or grinding grain. And in this intimate, everyday setting, the master of the craft was most often the woman of the house. For ordinary Egyptians, beer was not a commodity to be purchased. It was a nutritious, life-sustaining beverage to be produced as part of the weekly rhythm of meal preparation. The tools found in domestic contexts tell this story clearly. Instead of rows of massive zurd jars set into benches, a home brewery would have consisted of just a few key items: a medium-sized pottery vessel for mixing and fermenting, a handheld grinding quern for processing a small amount of grain, and a woven reed sieve for straining the finished product. These were not specialized tools used only for brewing. They were the same versatile implements used for preparing the family's daily bread and other food. This seamless integration of brewing into the culinary routine is key to understanding its role. The process likely began on the same day as baking. After grinding enough emmer wheat for the family's bread, a woman would set aside a portion of the coarse flour specifically for beer. She would mix it with water to form a slightly wetter dough than for bread, perhaps adding a handful of crushed dates saved from the last harvest. This dough would be shaped into a few small, flat discs, the household version of bat beer, given a quick toast in the oven, right alongside the larger, properly baked loaves for the table. While the bread finished baking, the partially baked beer loaves would be taken out, cooled, and then crumbled into the family's fermentation jar. Adding warm water, she would mix it by hand, cover the jar with a cloth, and set it in a cool corner of the home. In just a few days, with minimal extra effort, the household would have its own supply of fresh, nutritious beer. This wasn't a separate, complicated chore. It was a natural extension of the process that put bread on the table, a brilliant efficiency that ensured a constant supply of safe hydration and vital calories. The prominence of women in this domestic sphere is powerfully illustrated by artistic and textual evidence. Tomb models from the Middle Kingdom, designed to magically provide for the deceased in the afterlife, frequently show female figures engaged in every stage of the brewing process. We see them grinding grain, mixing the mash in pots, and most characteristically, straining the fermented beer through a sieve into a waiting jar. These models were placed in tombs because the activities they depicted were essential for a comfortable afterlife, and the responsibility for providing beer fell to the woman of the household. This domestic production had a character all its own. While state breweries aimed for consistency to feed thousands, homebrewed beer would have varied wonderfully from one dwelling to the next. The unique blend of wild yeasts in each home, the specific ratio of grain to dates chosen by the brewer, and even the minerals in the local water supply would have created a unique signature flavor for each family's beer. A neighbor might be known for a particularly sweet brew, while another was prized for a pleasant, tangy sharpness. This deep-rooted domestic tradition also helps explain one of the most fascinating figures in Egyptian mythology, the goddess Hathor. Known as the Lady of Drunkenness, and closely associated with beer, joy, and music, Hathor embodies the dual nature of the beverage. She could be a nurturing, motherly figure, providing the sustenance of beer, but also a dangerous, unpredictable force when provoked. This mirrors the reality of the household brewer. The woman who produced the life-giving drink that nourished her family also held the power to create a substance that could alter minds and inspire ecstatic celebration. The beer she made could soothe a crying child, give strength to her working husband, and also be the centerpiece of a village festival. The domestic production of beer, therefore, was about far more than mere subsistence. It was an act of care, a demonstration of skill, and a small-scale reflection of the same creative and spiritual power that, on a national level, built pyramids and sustained the gods. It confirms that from the grandest temple to the most modest mud brick home, beer was the unifying thread, a truly democratic staple that flowed through every level of ancient Egyptian society. To truly appreciate the scale of beer's importance, we need to move beyond the brewing vats and into the hands of the consumers, specifically the immense workforce that literally built Egypt's legacy. Historical records provide us with astonishingly precise details, and they reveal that beer was not just a casual perk, but a meticulously calculated form of sustenance, as vital to construction as the stone itself. The most famous evidence comes from the archives associated with the builders of the Great Pyramids at Giza. Papyrus documents and inscriptions detail a highly organized state distribution system where workers received a daily wage, not in coins, but in essential goods. This triad of sustenance almost always consisted of bread, beer, and onions. Imagine ending your shift hauling multi-ton limestone blocks and being handed your pay, several large loaves of dense emmer bread, a bunch of pungent onions, and most crucially, several jars of freshly brewed beer. Let's put those rations into a practical perspective. While the exact volume could vary based on the worker's role and the period, a standard daily ration for a laborer is believed to have been around 1 gallon of beer. That's not a typo, 1 gallon per person per day. Think about carrying that amount of liquid in a modern milk jug. This wasn't about getting drunk, it was a matter of survival and efficiency. Under the relentless Egyptian sun, dehydration was a constant and deadly threat. Water from the Nile, while life-giving, could be contaminated with bacteria and parasites, causing debilitating illnesses like dysentery. The beer, however, was inherently safer. The process of boiling the water during the initial stages of preparing the mash, followed by fermentation, killed off many harmful pathogens, making it a far more reliable source of hydration for thousands of concentrated workers. But this gallon of beer was much more than just safe water. It was a calorie-dense, nutritious meal in a liquid form, the thick, porridge-like consistency, filled with suspended particles of emmer wheat and date sugars, delivered a powerful combination of carbohydrates, proteins, and B vitamin. For a laborer engaged in physically exhausting work from dawn until dusk, this beer provided a slow-release source of energy that was far more effective than water alone. It staved off hunger, replenished electrolytes lost through sweat, and provided the sheer caloric fuel needed to maintain such a brutal pace of labor. The alcohol content, which was likely relatively low by modern standards, perhaps around 3%, would have offered a mild analgesic effect, soothing sore muscles and taking the edge off the physical pain of the day's work, while the slight euphoria could boost morale and foster a sense of communal bonding among the crews. This system of payment was a stroke of brilliant logistical planning by the Egyptian state. By compensating workers with the very commodities they produced, they created a closed, efficient economic loop. The grain harvested from state-owned farms was processed in state-run bakeries and breweries into the bread and beer that then fed the state's most important asset, its labor force. This ensured that the workers who built the monuments that glorified the pharaoh and the gods were consistently well-fed, hydrated, and healthy. A disruption in this supply chain, as records from Deir el-Medina sometimes mention, was a serious crisis that could lead to strikes, some of the first recorded labor disputes in history halting work on a pharaoh's tomb until the beer rations were restored. This wasn't a request for a luxury, it was a demand for the basic fuel required to do their jobs. The daily gallon of beer, therefore, stands as a powerful testament to its irreplaceable role. It was the liquid engine that powered the hands that raised the pyramids, a calculated and essential provision that turned an agricultural surplus into stone monuments destined to endure for eternity. But this sacred connection was not merely symbolic. It was an active, daily exchange between the earthly and the divine realms. The ancient Egyptians believed that the gods did not just appreciate the gesture of an offering, they literally consumed its spiritual essence, its cup. When a priest poured out a jar of beer before a statue of Osiris in a darkened temple chamber, they weren't just leaving a gift, they were providing a meal. The deity would absorb the life-sustaining force of the beer, leaving behind only the physical, inert substance for the temple staff. This belief meant that the quality of the offering was of utmost importance. Presenting anything less than the finest beer, brewed with the purest ingredients and following the most precise rituals, would be an insult to the god, potentially jeopardizing the cosmic balance, or mat, upon which all existence depended. This is why the largest and most sophisticated breweries were often attached directly to major temples. They were divine kitchens, producing the spiritual sustenance required to keep the gods strong and favorably disposed toward Egypt. This divine thirst is beautifully illustrated in the rich artwork adorning the walls of tombs and temples. One common scene shows the deceased, often accompanied by his wife, standing before a table heaped with offerings. Among the loaves of bread, cuts of meat, and bundles of vegetables, tall, slender jars of beer are prominently displayed. In these funerary contexts, the beer serves a dual purpose. It is both an offering to the gods, asking for their protection and a favorable judgment in the afterlife, and a provision for the deceased's own ka, ensuring it would never go hungry or thirsty in the next world. In some tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, we see even more direct interactions. The goddess Hathor, easily identified by her cow ears or full bovine head, is depicted accepting a bowl of beer from a pharaoh. Hathor's title, Lady of Drunkenness, reveals a more complex aspect of her character. She was a goddess of joy, music, and love, and beer was central to her ecstatic festivals. Yet, in the famous destruction of mankind myth, it is beer that saves humanity. The sun god Ra, angered by humanity's rebellion, sends a savage eye of his daughter Hathor to slaughter them. To stop the carnage, Ra orders that thousands of jugs of beer be dyed red with ochre and poured across the land. Mistaking the red beer for blood, Hathor drinks it, becomes blissfully intoxicated, and falls asleep, forgetting her murderous rampage. In this story, beer is not just an offering, it is a tool of divine pacification, a means of literally soothing the fury of a goddess. Beyond the great state gods like Osiris and Hathor, there was a deity who embodied the very craft of brewing herself, the lesser-known but deeply important goddess Tenenet. Her name is thought to be linked to the Egyptian word for beer, tenemu, making her the personification of the beverage. Tenenet was the patroness of beer and its production, overseeing the entire process from the germination of the grain to the joyful consumption of the final product. While she doesn't have the vast mythology of a major deity, her presence was felt in the daily practice of brewing, particularly in the domestic sphere. A brewer, whether a woman in her home or a priest in a temple, might offer a small prayer to Tenenet for a successful fermentation or for protection against the souring of a batch. She represents the intimate, hands-on knowledge and the sacred skill required to perform the alchemy of turning grain into a divine gift. Honoring Tenenet was a way of acknowledging that the process itself was holy, that the magic of fermentation was a power granted by the gods to humanity for their survival and their celebration. This profound spiritual role made beer an indispensable component of the most important journey an Egyptian would ever take, the passage into the afterlife. Elite tombs were regularly stocked with actual jars of beer, sealed and placed alongside other provisions to sustain the soul for eternity. For those who could not afford such literal stores, they relied on magic. Elaborate wooden models of breweries and bakeries were placed in tombs, complete with tiny figures of servants grinding grain, straining beer, and baking bread. These models were not mere decorations. Through the power of funerary spells, they were believed to become magically functional in the afterlife, ensuring an endless supply of fresh beer for the ka of the deceased. This need for eternal sustenance is captured perfectly in the Book of the Dead. In the critical scene of the negative confession, where the deceased's heart is weighed against the feather of truth, the soul declares to Osiris and the tribunal of gods, "I have not stopped the flow of water. I have not held up the beer jug." This was a serious ethical claim, asserting that one had never deprived another soul of its rightful sustenance, a sin that could tip the scales against them. From the grandest temple ritual to the most personal plea in the Hall of Judgment, beer was woven into the spiritual fabric of existence, a sacred thread connecting the daily life of the people to the eternal power of the gods. This practical understanding of beer's nourishing properties extended far beyond the dinner bowl and into the realm of ancient medicine, where it was prescribed with surprising specificity by Egyptian physicians. Our clearest window into this practice comes from a remarkable document known as the Ebers Papyrus, a massive scroll dating back to around 1550 before the Common Era, which compiles an extensive collection of medical knowledge and remedies. Within its carefully inked hieratic script, beer is not listed as a simple tonic for general health. It appears as a critical ingredient in dozens of precise prescriptions, functioning as much more than just a liquid. For the ancient Egyptian healer, beer served as a versatile base, a solvent, and an active component in its own right, used to treat a wide spectrum of ailments that afflicted people from all walks of life. The reasons for its effectiveness were both chemical and practical. As a liquid, beer provided an ideal medium for suspending and delivering other medicinal compounds. When a physician prescribed a mixture of bitter herbs or unpalatable minerals, grinding them into a powder and mixing them with beer made the concoction far easier to swallow than dry powder or plain water. But the beer itself contributed therapeutic qualities. The alcohol content, though likely modest, acted as a mild antiseptic and a solvent, helping to extract the active properties from plants and herbs more effectively than water alone could. Furthermore, the live yeast sediment at the bottom of a beer jar was a rich source of B vitamins, particularly thiamine and riboflavin, nutrients essential for metabolic function and overall vitality. A patient suffering from malnutrition or digestive issues would receive not just the targeted herb, but a boost of vitamins and calories from the beer base, aiding their recovery in multiple ways simultaneously. The Ebers Papyrus reveals a remarkably nuanced approach, with physicians specifying different types of beer for different conditions, demonstrating a sophisticated empirical understanding. For instance, a remedy aimed at soothing a digestive complaint or a simple cough might call for fresh, sweet beer, leveraging its pleasant taste and gentle warmth. However, other, more complex prescriptions are far more specific. Some formulas explicitly call for sediment beer or the dregs from the brewing vat. This thick, yeast-rich sludge was recognized as being particularly potent, likely used for patients who were weak or deficient, as the concentrated yeast would have been a powerful source of nutrient. Even more intriguing are the prescriptions that require stale or sour beer. This wasn't a case of using spoiled product, it was a deliberate choice. When beer sours, lactic acid bacteria take over, creating a beverage similar to a modern probiotic drink. An Egyptian physician prescribing sour beer for an intestinal ailment was, without knowing the science of microbiology, effectively administering a treatment to rebalance the gut flora, soothing inflammation and aiding digestion through the presence of beneficial acid. The range of ailments treated with these beer-based remedies is astonishing. There are prescriptions for respiratory problems, where ingredients like honey and juniper berries were mixed into warm beer to create a soothing syrup for a sore throat or a congested chest. For digestive issues, combinations of celery, cumin, or other carminative herbs were blended into beer to relieve gas and stomach pain. There are even recipes for topical applications, where beer was mixed with fats and resins to create salves for wounds or skin conditions, with the alcohol providing a gentle cleansing action. One particularly fascinating remedy from the papyrus suggests a mixture of beer, acacia leaves, and honey to treat a condition involving excessive saliva production, demonstrating the creative combination of available resources. This medical use underscores a fundamental truth about ancient Egyptian beer. It was never just one thing. It was a food, a currency, a religious offering, and a pharmaceutical. Its role in the medicine cabinet of a healer confirms that its value was perceived in holistic terms. It was a substance that sustained life, cured illness, and comforted the afflicted, a true cornerstone of wellness in the ancient world. Given everything we now know about the ingredients and the open, spontaneous fermentation process, we can begin to reconstruct the most personal aspect of this ancient beverage, its actual flavor. If you were handed a freshly strained jar of this beer, the first thing to strike you would undoubtedly be its appearance. Forget the clear, golden hue of a modern lager. This drink would have been intensely cloudy, possessing an opaque, milky brown color, like murky river water thick with silt. Its consistency would be substantial, more akin to a thin porridge or a modern-day health food smoothie than a crisp filtered beer. You would likely see a fine sediment already settling at the bottom of the cup, a visible reminder of its grainy origins. Bringing the cup to your nose, the aroma would be complex and probably quite unfamiliar. The most dominant note would be a pronounced sourness, a sharp, tangy scent similar to sourdough bread starter or a robust yogurt. This signature tartness came directly from the wild fermentation, where lactic acid bacteria worked alongside the yeast, giving the beer a refreshing, acidic kick. Underneath that sour blanket, you would detect the deep, bready, almost nutty aroma of the emmer wheat, a wholesome scent like toasted whole grain bread. And weaving through it all would be a subtle, honey-like sweetness from the dates, not overpowering, but providing a fragrant counterpoint to the tartness. There might even be faint, unpredictable whispers of other aromas, a hint of spice from coriander, a grassy note from the reeds of the sieve, or an earthy funk unique to the local microbes. Now for the taste. The first sip would be a surprising textural experience. The beer would feel grainy on the tongue, with tiny particles of the emmer husks and date flesh contributing a slight grit. The flavor profile would unfold in layers. The initial sensation would be that bright lactic sourness, puckering and refreshing, much like a modern Belgian lambic or a German Berliner Weiss. This would quickly be balanced by the gentle, caramel-like sweetness of the dates, preventing the sourness from being overwhelming. The emmer wheat would provide a sturdy, earthy backbone, a flavor of nuts and whole grains that gave the beer its substantial, meal-like quality. The alcohol content was almost certainly low, likely around 3%, so you wouldn't get a strong alcoholic burn. Instead, the experience would be about the interplay of sour, sweet, and earthy, with a very mild bitterness perhaps coming from the toasted crust of the Batbier bread. The best modern comparison isn't really a single commercial beer, but rather a combination of experiences. Imagine the tart, funky complexity of a rustic, unfiltered farmhouse ale, perhaps from a small Belgian producer. Now, blend that with the thick, nutritious body and grainy texture of a thin, fermented porridge like kvass, a traditional Slavic beverage made from rye bread. The overall sensation would be refreshing yet filling, a drink you could quaff to quench your thirst under the hot sun, but one that would also genuinely contribute to staving off hunger. It would be an acquired taste for a modern palate accustomed to clean, hop-forward beers, but its balanced acidity and natural sweetness would have made it a genuinely pleasant daily beverage for the ancient Egyptian. This unique flavor was not a flaw. It was the direct result of a process that prioritized nutrition, safety, and efficient production over clarity and uniformity, creating a taste that was truly the flavor of an entire civilization. These incredibly detailed tomb scenes are far more than just decoration. They are a form of ancient technical documentation, a visual instruction manual painted for eternity to ensure the deceased would have a perpetual supply of beer. One of the most magnificent and frequently studied examples comes from the Old Kingdom tomb of a high official named Tai at Saqqara. The walls of Tai's mastaba are a riot of activity, depicting every aspect of life on his estate, and the brewing sequence is rendered with a clarity that allows us to follow the process almost frame by frame. We see the entire production line, from raw grain to finished beverage, frozen in time for over 4,000 years. The artists pay meticulous attention to the tools and the actions of the people, providing an unparalleled window into the practical realities of a 5th dynasty brewery. The sequence often begins with the processing of the grain. In one section of the scene, we see male workers using heavy grinders. They are depicted kneeling on the ground, rocking large handheld grinding stones back and forth over a stationary slab, known as a saddle quern, to crush the hardy emmer wheat into a coarse flour. The posture of the workers conveys the sheer physical effort required. This was back-breaking labor. The resulting flour is then shown being carried in baskets to the next stage, where it is mixed with water. Here, the scene often shifts to focus on female figures, who are shown vigorously kneading the mixture into a thick dough for the beer bread, or Batbier. Their active poses, with arms deep in large pottery bowls, capture the hands-on nature of the work. The dough is then shaped into the characteristic small, round loaves. Next, the artists illustrate the crucial, partial baking of these loaves. The Batbier discs are shown being placed into conical bread molds, which are then stacked inside a beehive-shaped oven. The key detail here is that the loaves are not left in for long. They are depicted as being withdrawn quickly, with their exteriors lightly toasted, but their interiors remaining raw and moist, exactly as the hybrid theory of brewing suggests was necessary. After cooling, the scenes show the loaves being crumbled by hand into a large, wide-mouthed fermentation vat. This is where the action becomes particularly vivid. Women are frequently shown standing over these large jars, using their hands to mix the crumbled bread with water poured from smaller jugs. They are deep in the task of mashing, ensuring every particle is saturated to begin the sacred process of fermentation. Perhaps the most iconic image from these tomb scenes is the straining process. This is the moment where the thick, porridge-like fermented mash is transformed into a drinkable liquid. The artist depicts this with brilliant efficiency. A servant, again often a woman, is shown kneeling before two large jars. She holds a finely woven sieve, shaped like a shallow bowl, over an empty vessel. With her other hand, she is pouring the murky contents of the fermentation vat through this sieve. You can almost see the thick liquid flowing through the mesh, while the spent grain and husks are trapped behind. This single image captures the final, essential step of clarification, separating the nutritious beverage from the solid mash. The strained beer is then shown being decanted into smaller, elegant serving jars, ready for consumption. The entire narrative, from grinding to serving, is a testament to the Egyptian desire to record and preserve not just the grand events of history, but the essential, everyday crafts that made life and the afterlife possible. For all the vivid descriptions from tomb paintings and the logical deductions from archaeological finds, there has always been an element of speculation. We could describe the tools and the process, but could we ever be truly certain about the contents of those clay jars? This is where the narrative of ancient Egyptian brewing makes a breathtaking leap from informed interpretation to scientific fact, thanks to the fascinating field of archaeological chemistry. While historians piece together the how from art and texts, chemists unlock the what by analyzing the jars themselves, searching for invisible fingerprints left behind by the beer that vanished millennia ago. The key to this detective work lies in the remarkable durability of certain organic compounds. When an ancient Egyptian jar was used to brew, store, or serve beer, a thin, microscopic layer of residue became trapped in the pores of the unglazed pottery. Over centuries, the liquid itself evaporated, and any visible remains decayed, but the chemical building blocks of the ingredients, their lipid and acid molecules, bonded tenaciously to the ceramic fabric. These molecules can survive for thousands of years, creating a unique chemical signature that is invisible to the naked eye, but perfectly detectable with modern instruments. To read this signature, archaeologists carefully collect tiny samples of pottery, often scraping powder from the inner surfaces of broken sherds found at brewery sites or in tombs. These samples are then subjected to a powerful duo of analytical techniques: gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. Think of this process as the most precise form of ingredient sorting imaginable. First, gas chromatography acts like an ultra-fine sieve. The sample is vaporized and carried by an inert gas through a long, thin column. Different chemical compounds travel through this column at different speeds, effectively separating them from one another. As they exit the column one by one, they enter the mass spectrometer, which functions as a molecular scale and identifier. It electrically charges the molecules and measures their mass, producing a unique graph or spectrum for each one. By comparing these ancient spectra to those of known modern compounds, scientists can say with astonishing certainty, this peak right here is oxalic acid, or this pattern matches tartaric acid. So, what have these molecular fingerprints revealed? The detection of oxalic acid is a major clue. This compound is a known marker for the presence of grain, specifically from the tribe of grasses that includes both barley and emmer wheat. While it doesn't distinguish between the two on its own, finding it in jars from a context where emmer was the dominant crop strongly supports the artistic and textual evidence that this was the primary brewing grain. An even more telling discovery has been the consistent identification of tartaric acid. This specific acid is a classic biomarker for grapes, and in the context of the ancient Mediterranean, it's a sure sign of wine. However, in the context of ancient Egypt, where grapes were a luxury item and dates were ubiquitous, its presence points overwhelmingly to dates being a key ingredient. The tartaric acid from dates would have survived the fermentation process and embedded itself in the pottery, providing the first hard chemical proof that Egyptian brewers were indeed using this fruit to sweeten and strengthen their beer, just as the historical clues suggested. Beyond confirming the main ingredients, residue analysis has revealed even more subtle details. Scientists have also identified traces of yeast markers within these ancient residues. This doesn't mean they found living yeast cells; those proteins degrade over time, but rather the chemical byproducts of their activity. This evidence confirms that the fermentation was indeed a biological process driven by yeast, aligning perfectly with our understanding of the open vat method. Furthermore, the specific blend of acids found can sometimes hint at the beer's character. The presence of both tartaric acid from dates and other compounds indicative of lactic acid suggests a complex flavor profile, a beer that was both sweet and sour, a conclusion that perfectly matches our sensory reconstruction based on the process. Each chemical signature is like a single word from a lost recipe, and by combining them, we are slowly learning to read the entire text. This scientific evidence closes the loop, transforming our understanding from a well-supported hypothesis into a confirmed chapter of history, written not in hieroglyphs, but in molecules. This profound belief in an afterlife that mirrored the comforts of the physical world finds its most tangible expression not in grand temples, but in the silent, dark chambers of the tomb. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transition to a new existence. And just as a person needed sustenance in this life, their spiritual essence, or ka, would require nourishment for eternity. Beer, being as fundamental as bread, was therefore an essential provision for this endless journey. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a practical necessity. Elite tombs were routinely stocked with actual, functional supplies, and among the most important items placed alongside the deceased were jars of beer, carefully sealed and often labeled with the name of the brewer or the estate that produced them, guaranteeing a supply of familiar, life-sustaining refreshment in the world to come. For those who could not afford to fill a tomb chamber with vast quantities of perishable goods, or perhaps as a magical backup to the real provisions, the Egyptians devised an ingenious solution: model breweries. These were not mere toys or decorations, they were magically functional scale models, intricate dioramas designed to operate forever. Crafted from wood, pottery, and paint, these models depict the entire beer-making process in miniature. You might see a scene with tiny figures of servants, no more than a few inches high, grinding grain on a miniature saddle quern. Another figure kneads dough in a small bowl, while yet another strains the finished beer from a model vat into a waiting jar. These models were activated by powerful spells recited during the burial ceremony, intended to transform the miniature representations into an eternal, self-replenishing source of beer for the ka of the deceased. The belief was that the model's magic would ensure the deceased never suffered thirst or hunger, a constant, automated brewery working tirelessly in the afterlife. One of the most spectacular confirmations of this practice, bridging the gap between archaeological theory and hard scientific fact, comes from the tomb of a preternastic ruler known as King Scorpion I at Abydos. When archaeologists explored his burial chamber, they discovered a wealth of grave goods, but among the most significant were hundreds of jars, many of which still contain the residue of their original content. These were not empty ceremonial vessels, they were the king's actual provisions for the afterlife. What made this find revolutionary was that modern science could now analyze these residues with techniques unimaginable just a few decades ago. Using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, researchers were able to detect the chemical fingerprints left behind by the beer that had evaporated thousands of years ago. The analysis revealed a complex recipe. The chemical signatures confirmed the presence of emmer wheat, but also something more: evidence of savory herbs and other flavorings, and crucially, the absence of any markers for grapes, pointing firmly to dates as the primary sweetener. This was not a simple grain and water brew, it was a sophisticated beverage, perhaps specially formulated for a king. The chemical evidence from Scorpion's tomb provides the ultimate validation of the artistic and textual records. It proves conclusively that the jars placed in tombs were indeed filled with real beer, and it gives us an unprecedented glimpse into the specific ingredients used at the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. This scientific window transforms our understanding from an educated guess into a confirmed fact, showing us that the desire to ensure a comfortable afterlife with a steady supply of beer was a concern even for the earliest pharaohs, a tradition that would continue and become more elaborate for the next 3,000 years. This practice underscores a universal human hope that the comforts of home, even something as simple as a familiar drink, would follow us into whatever lies beyond. Yet for all its enduring power, the reign of emmer beer was not destined to last forever. The traditions that had sustained a civilization for millennia began to face new pressures, not from within the Nile Valley, but from the growing influence of the wider Mediterranean world. The pivotal turning point arrived with the conquest of Egypt, by Alexander the Great in the 4th century before the Common Era, an event that marked the beginning of the Ptolemaic period. The Greeks, and later the Romans who absorbed Egypt into their own vast empire, brought with them their own deeply ingrained culinary and agricultural preferences. To these new rulers, the thick, porridge-like beer of the Egyptians was a curious, even primitive beverage. They were a wine-drinking culture, and their palates were accustomed to clearer, more refined drinks. This cultural shift in the ruling class created a new standard for what a sophisticated beverage should be. The most significant practical challenge for these new influences was the inherent nature of emmer wheat itself. Remember, emmer is a hulled grain, its kernels tightly encased in a tough, inedible husk. This characteristic, which made it so resilient in the field, made it notoriously difficult to process for brewing in the way other cultures had perfected. The Greeks and Romans were far more familiar with barley, a grain that had become the gold standard for brewing across much of Europe and the Near East. Barley offered a distinct and powerful advantage. It is a naked grain. When barley is malted, soaked to encourage germination, the husk easily separates from the kernel during threshing. This made the malting process itself far simpler and more efficient. Brewers could consistently produce malted barley with a high concentration of the diastase enzymes needed to convert starches into sugar, leading to a more predictable and controllable fermentation. This shift from emmer to barley represented a fundamental change in brewing technology. The Egyptian hybrid method, which relied on partially baked bread to potentially kickstart enzymatic activity, was an ingenious but somewhat unpredictable artisanal process. The barley-based method, centered on deliberate malting, was a more direct and scientific approach. Barley malt produced a wort, the liquid extracted from the mashing process, that was inherently less cloudy. Without the fine, stubborn husks of emmer, the resulting beer could be strained to a much clearer, brighter liquid that appealed to the aesthetic tastes of the new Greco-Roman elite. This clarity also contributed to a longer shelf life and greater stability, making it a more practical commodity for trade across the vast Roman Empire. As the agricultural landscape of Egypt gradually transformed to meet the demands of its new rulers and the lucrative export markets, the cultivation of emmer wheat began a slow but steady decline. Vast fields that had once shimmered with the golden heads of emmer were increasingly given over to barley, as well as to grapes for the wine industry that the Ptolemies and Romans enthusiastically promoted. The state-sponsored breweries that had once produced millions of gallons of emmer beer to pay pyramid workers were replaced by commercial operations geared toward a different kind of consumer. The unique, localized microbiome of wild yeasts that had given each village beer its distinct character was slowly supplanted by more standardized brewing practices. The ancient sacred connection between the brewer, the grain, and the gods, so beautifully documented in tombs, faded into memory, becoming a relic of a bygone era. The beer that had built the pyramids did not vanish overnight, but over centuries it retreated from the centers of power and commerce, lingering only in the most rural and traditional of households, until even those final bastions of the old ways eventually fell silent. Yet for all our scientific analysis and artistic interpretation, there remained a tantalizing question that only a practical experiment could answer. What did this ancient beer actually taste like? This curiosity has fueled a fascinating movement where the worlds of archaeology and modern craft brewing have collided, leading to ambitious projects aimed at resurrecting the exact recipes of the pharaohs. One of the most significant early attempts took place not in a brewery, but in a museum, the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, which houses one of the world's most important collections of antiquities. Here, archaeologists teamed up with brewers to undertake a painstaking recreation based directly on the evidence from tomb paintings and residue analysis. Their goal was not to create a commercially viable product, but to conduct a true archaeological experiment to see if the described process would indeed yield a potable, fermented beverage. The challenges they faced were immense, starting with the primary ingredient, emmer wheat. This ancient grain, so crucial to the original flavor and process, is no longer a common crop. The team had to source authentic emmer and then grapple with its stubborn, hold nature. Without the millennia of agricultural selection that created modern, easy-to-process grains, the emmer required extensive labor to thresh and prepare, just as it had for the ancient Egyptian. Then came the core of the experiment, replicating the Bapir method. They baked loaves of emmer dough only partially, creating a hard, toasted crust with a soft, starchy interior. Crumbling these loaves into warm water created the familiar mash, to which they added crushed dates for sweetness. The most critical and unpredictable step was fermentation. In a bold decision to stay true to the historical method, they did not pitch a controlled, modern yeast strain. Instead, they left the mixture in open vats, inviting the wild yeasts native to Turin to work their magic, just as the wild microbes of Thebes or Memphis would have done thousands of years ago. Perhaps the most famous of these recreations, however, was led by the adventurous American craft brewery, Dogfish Head. Their project, dubbed Midas Touch, was initially based on residue analysis from funerary vessels found in the tomb of the legendary King Midas in Turkey, but their research led them deep into the ancient brewing traditions of the entire region, including Egypt. For a subsequent project more directly focused on Egypt, brewer Sam Calagiani embraced the same core challenges. The Dogfish Head team discovered that working with emmer and relying on spontaneous fermentation produced a beer that was utterly unlike anything on the modern market. The wild yeast imparted a pronounced, funky sourness, while the emmer wheat contributed a deep, grainy, almost spicy character that barley simply doesn't have. The dates added a subtle honey-like sweetness that balanced the tartness, but without the cloying quality of modern sweeteners. The taster's descriptions of the final product are remarkably consistent and illuminating. They reported a hazy, golden amber drink with a low, persistent head. The aroma was complex, sour and bready, like a sourdough starter, with a distinct note of green apple from the wild fermentation and the gentle fragrance of honey from the date. On the palate, it was both surprising and familiar. The sourness was the first thing to register, clean and refreshing, followed by the earthy, nutty flavor of the emmer. The body was notably thin, especially when compared to the porridge-like consistency we imagine from ancient times, largely because modern recreations typically strain the beer more thoroughly to meet contemporary drinking expectation. The alcohol content was modest, around 4 to 5%, making it a sessionable beverage. The overall impression was of a dry, tart, and highly refreshing drink, more akin to a rustic farmhouse ale or a natural cider than a standard beer. These modern experiments yielded more than just a novel beverage. They provided profound archaeological insights. By physically going through the motions, the brewers encountered problems and solutions that text alone could never reveal. For instance, they found that the partially baked Bapir loaves were not just a clever way to preserve the dough. They were exceptionally effective at creating a stable, sugary wort. The act of crumbling the bread by hand allowed for a more gradual hydration and sugar extraction than simply milling the grain, which could lead to a stuck mash. The open fermentation, while unpredictable, created a complex acidity that would have acted as a natural preservative in Egypt's warm climate. The biggest surprise for many modern brewers was the drinkability of the final product. Despite its unconventional ingredients and method, the beer was not a harsh, unpalatable gruel. It was a balanced, interesting, and genuinely enjoyable drink that made the ancient Egyptians' devotion to it completely understandable. These projects bridge a gap of thousands of years, allowing us to share a sensory experience with the workers who built the pyramids, and in doing so, they transform the ancient recipe from a historical footnote into a living, breathing testament to human ingenuity. So as we bring our exploration to a close, it becomes clear that the story of ancient Egyptian beer is far more than a quaint historical footnote. It is, in fact, a powerful lens through which we can view the entire civilization. This humble beverage was a remarkable technological achievement, born from an empirical understanding of chemistry that allowed them to harness invisible forces through the clever creation of Bapir and open-air fermentation. It was the engine of a complex economy, a form of liquid currency that literally paid the wages of the thousands of hands that erected the world's most enduring monuments. On a spiritual plane, it served as a sacred bridge to the divine, a necessary offering to gods like Osiris and Hathor, and a crucial provision for the soul's eternal journey. And on the most human level, it was a daily comfort, a nutritious meal in a jar that hydrated, nourished, and brought a moment of respite to everyone from the pharaoh to the farmer. The legacy of these ancient brewers extends far beyond the banks of the Nile. Their foundational techniques using grain, water, and wild yeast form the very bedrock of the global brewing tradition we enjoy today. While our methods have been refined with stainless steel and temperature control, the core alchemy of fermentation remains unchanged. The next time you hold a glass of modern craft beer with its complex aromas and flavors, take a moment to consider its profound ancestry. You are participating in a ritual that connects you directly to the artisans of Deir el-Medina, to the physicians who prescribed beer-based remedies, and to the men and women who 4,000 years ago gathered in the shade to share a jar of their local brew. Their innovation reminds us that some of humanity's greatest accomplishments are not always carved in stone. Sometimes they are poured into a clay cup, a testament to the enduring power of a simple, good brew to sustain both the body and the spirit of a culture.